Novus Ordo is of the devil. The Novus Ordo is the greatest thing of all time. What the heck is going on? Welcome to episode 2. Enjoy. Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. In this episode, which is the second one of a series on all the issues surrounding the Second Vatican Council, we're going to take a look at the liturgy. So, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to read from the memoirs of Louis Bouillet, who was a phenomenal theologian of the 20th century. He was a Lutheran and converted in the 30s to the Catholic Church, and became a prolific theological writer. And he was eventually called by Paul VI to attend the Second Vatican Council, and was also part of the commission after the council that put together the new missal, the one that you see in most parishes today. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to quote Father Bouillet when he quotes both Ratzinger, and Ratzinger quoting St. Gregory of Nazianzus. Bouillet says, "The incompetence, intrigue, and smoke and mirrors in the discussions that follow, as St. Gregory Nazianzen showed, with respect to the Council of Constantinople, gradually undermine the effect that such a concelebration could or might have initially had on the participants." So what Father Bouillet here is talking about is the opening mass of any council, really, where all the bishops of the world, or at least those that can make it to the council, come together to celebrate the Eucharist. So there is a real unity around the Eucharistic Lord in a council, right? They come together, and that's why it's called an ecumenical council, because, ecumenical meaning the gathering of all into one. So, Father Bouillet is saying towards the end of councils, there tends to be, according to what St. Gregory tells us, and Ratzinger notes this, a kind of, disputes, people going back and forth between what they want, their agenda, as you might say, and, it's basically the council ends with relief that it's over, because you can only talk for so long, and, people want to get their own agenda to be applied. So, Bouillet continues, "All that divine assistance can assure to the successors of the apostles is the absence of possible error in the doctrinal definitions that such assemblies venture to produce. But short of this extreme case, any measure of approximation, insufficiency, or mere superficiality is to be expected, even from so sacrosanct an assembly." In other words, what Bouillet is saying is kind of what we said last week, which is basically that you can expect a council to not defect, but you have a lot of characters, some, with idiosyncrasies, agendas, intentions, you name it, right? But the Spirit, as we saw, uses what is given in history in order to work his providential plan. And we're going to look here at the liturgy. First of all, I'm going to quote directly from St. Gregory, who says, quote, "To tell the truth, I am convinced that every assembly of bishops is to be avoided. For I have never experienced a happy ending to any council, not even the abolition of abuses, but only ambition or wrangling about what was taking place." So St. Gregory's description of Constantinople I is very appropriate here, as we'll see. Bouillet goes on to explain that if the Church draws some good from them, the councils, right, it is only to the degree in which the senior officials, as they say today, in the apostolic succession, popes or bishops with influence, either because of the importance of their dioceses or because of their recognized merit, extricate what is essential from its surface and from its more or less appropriate side issues. But it is up to the sensus communis fidelium, understood to be those who truly are so, in the final analysis, to make it its own and, as a result, positive and effective by the benefit they derive from it on the level of the only spiritual progress that counts, that toward evangelical holiness. So the sensus communis fidelium, basically, he's speaking of the sense of the faithful. In other words, the faith of the church, right? The church as subject. We talked about this last time. And, from that quote, what we see is that he understands this idea that the church herself must actualize the council in her life here and now. So I'm basically here reiterating some stuff and kind of giving you the position of Father Bouillet. Now we're going to turn to when he was on the commission for the liturgy, and we're going to get into the murky waters of this affair. So now this commission was under the authority of Cardinal Lercaro, and Bouillet has nice things to say by him, but he does say that Cardinal Lercaro was rather naive. And so he says about this cardinal, in conjunction with Bunini, which is what we're going to talk about, he says the following. Cardinal Lercaro was completely incapable of standing up to the maneuvers of the smooth-talking villain, the Neapolitan Vincentian Bunini, who was not long in proving to be as devoid of culture as he was of simple honesty. Even without that, there was no hope of producing anything of much more value than what could be produced when one was claiming to remake comprehensively, in a few months, an entire liturgy that took 20 centuries to develop gradually. So, Father Bouillet is not very flattering of Bunini, right? And he's saying that he's straight up just says he's a dishonest man. So, and so he says that basically Cardinal Lercaro was a little naive and kind of impressionable. And so what we have here is this criticism of the fact that the liturgical books, so the missal, is being kind of composed in a few months, and what is discarded is this process of development that the previous missal underwent. Now, this isn't to say that the new missal is completely discontinuous with the old one. So you could say it's also a development of the old one, and so it's part of that 2,000 years of development. And we'll get into all those details and all those intricacies. But there is a sense in which he's not happy with what's going on in the concilium. So let's go ahead and continue with these quotes here. Father Bouillet says, "I cannot succeed in understanding by what aberration these excellent gentlemen, rather good historians and generally reasonable minds, could have made the equally disconcerting suggestion that the Roman canon should be dismembered and reconstructed, and formed other plans supposedly inspired by Hippolytus of Rome, but scarcely less harebrained. For my part, I was ready to resign immediately and return home. But Dom Bot convinced me to stay, if only to obtain a lesser evil." So he's very upset. He wanted to resign because he didn't like what was going on, but he was convinced by a friend to stay. And he continues, "Ultimately, the Roman canon was more or less respected." Okay, so that's good. "And we managed to produce 3 Eucharistic prayers that, in spite of quite wordy intercessions, retrieve pieces of great antiquity and unrivaled theological and euchological richness, out of use since the disappearance of the ancient Gallican rites." So he's saying, okay, so, we retained the Roman canon, good, untouched, great, awesome. And we even were able to kind of retrieve 3 different Eucharistic prayers that were very rich and very good. We'll talk about, whether it's good to have variety when it comes to choosing the canon of the Mass. We'll get into all that, don't worry. So, continuing here with Father Bouillet's criticisms, because it doesn't end, and, we have to be objective. We have to look at the history and see what we find. And so Father Bouillet continues. He says, between the indiscriminately archaeologizing fanatics who wanted to banish the Sanctus and the intercessions from the Eucharistic prayer by taking Hippolytus's Eucharist as it is, and others who did not care at all about his alleged apostolic tradition, but who wanted only some slipshod mass, Dom Botet and I were to take charge of piecing together its text so as to work in those elements that were certainly more ancient for the next day. Okay, so he's talking about this archaeologizing tendency, which he thought was just a bunch of academics coming together and disrespecting the spiritual and organic elements of the liturgy as the received, mode of prayer of the community. Ultimately, it's the the sacrifice of the Son to the Father in which we participate. We don't construct it; we receive it in a certain sense through the guidance of the Spirit. But he's also saying it's the Church is the guardian of the liturgy, and she prunes it, she takes care of it, she retrieves certain treasures that are needed, and all that. So he's not being completely unnuanced here, but it is. As we can see, it was very chaotic, and there was some questionable things. So continuing, he says, I prefer to say nothing, or virtually nothing, about the new calendar, the work of a trio of maniacs. So, Father Bouillet is very funny, so bear with me. The work of a trio of maniacs suppressing Septuagesima and the octave of Pentecost without any serious reason, and tossing 3/4 of the saints out, who knows where, on the basis of their own ideas. Since these three fanatics obstinately refused to change anything in their work, and since the Pope wanted to finish it quickly so as not to let chaos spread, their project was accepted, as outrageous as it was. So there's a good window into what happened, right? And he continues, the only element not open to criticism in this new missal was the enrichment provided above all by the resurrection of a good number of magnificent prefaces recovered from the ancient sacramentaries and the expansion of the biblical readings. Although on this latter point as well, they worked too quickly to produce anything that was entirely satisfactory. I will pass over the number of ancient prayers for penitential seasons that we were obliged to mutilate so as to empty them as much as possible, precisely of anything penitential. In return, one must nevertheless point out something newly composed that was not only irreproachable, but admirably appropriate. In other words, he's talking here about the New Common Preface number 1. He says, tribute should be paid to its author, a monk of Hautecombe, who restricted himself to combining with an uncommonly sure hand the most meaningful phrases of St. Paul while managing to respect the cursus. After all that, it should not be too surprising if, by its incredible weaknesses, the distorted specimen we produced was to incite ridicule or indignation. To the point of making one forget a number of excellent elements that are nonetheless scattered about in it, and that it would be a shame not to salvage, like lost pearls, in the revision that will sooner or later be inevitable. So you see here, what we have here is Father Bouillet saying the composition of the new missal was a mess. It was, historically. Father Bouillet is a expert in the liturgy. He's a phenomenal theologian, and, he was asked to stay in order to mitigate the chaos, right? And so, historically, it's just a fact that it was chaotic. Now, remember our last episode, right? And keep the context here in mind, which is the Holy Spirit makes use of what happens for his divine plan, for his providential plan. He also says here, as I've just read, that there's pearls that we get rid of at our detriment. But he also assumes that this is kind of a joke and it'll soon be fixed. I mean, it has to, right? Is kind of his mindset. Well, it doesn't really. But as we know, when Benedict becomes Pope, right, Joseph Ratzinger, he speaks of this very fixing that Bouillet expected, right, which is the reform of the reform. And that's going to be really the hermeneutic of this episode, which is there needs to be a reform of the reform. The liturgy was botched. This is just a historical fact. Now, he continues, to put an end to this sad story, I will note by what subterfuge Bunini obtained what was closest to his heart, or rather, what those who must be called his sponsors succeeded in getting passed through him. On several different occasions, whether in relation to the scudding of the liturgy of the dead, or even in that incredible undertaking of expurgating the psalms for use in the office, Bunini ran into an opposition that was not only massive, but one could say nearly unanimous. That's important. In such cases, he did not hesitate to say to us, quote, but the Pope wants it, end quote. After that, of course, there was no longer any question of disputing it. One day, however, and this is a really cool story, a really cool anecdote. One day, however, when he used this argument, I was to have lunch with my friend Monsignor Del Gallo, who, as First Chamberlain, had at that time an apartment just below the papal apartments. When I was coming back down, after the siesta, of course, when I came out of the elevator onto the Cortile di San Damaso, Bunini himself emerged from the staircase, coming from the bronze gate. At the sight of me, not only did he go pale, but he was visibly aghast. I immediately understood that, knowing me to be notus pontifici, which means that, he was called by the Pope to be on the commission, he supposed that I was coming from the Pope's residence. But in my innocence, I could not guess why he would at that point be terrorized by the idea that I had been able to discuss our affairs with him. The answer would be provided to me, but only weeks later, and by Pope Paul VI himself. Talking with me about our famous work, which he had in the end ratified, without being much more satisfied with it than I was, he said to me, quote, so this is the Pope talking to Father Bouillet, quote, but why, then, did you stick this in this reform? And there I must admit that I no longer recall which of the details I have mentioned bothered him in particular. Naturally, I responded, but quite simply because Bunini told us that you absolutely wanted it. His reaction was immediate. Quote, is that possible? He said to me personally that you were unanimous in this respect. So what we see here is the Pope being surprised by Father Bouillet that, in fact, the changes were orchestrated not by the intentions of the Holy Father and not by the unanimous intentions, of the concilium members, except for Bunini and his associates. So, ill-intentioned person, dishonest person. To conclude, so I want to add this funny remark, which doesn't have to do with liturgy, but I think it's appropriate here because we're talking about Father Bouillet. It's a pretty funny story. Father Bouillet says he just met Joseph Ratzinger, bumped into him, and this is what he says: the clarity of vision, the very large amount of information, the intellectual courage, and at the same time, the penetrating discernment of Joseph Ratzinger were very particularly evident, as was also his sense of humor, which was full of kindness, but not easily deceived. And then he says, I will quote only one remark that Ratzinger whispered to me after 3/4 of an hour of Karl Rahner shouting himself hoarse in repeating a diatribe obviously composed for what the Americans call televidiots. And this is Ratzinger, who whispers in Bouillet's ear, another monologue on dialogue, ending with a sigh and a smile in my direction. So anyway, Father Bouillet is absolutely hilarious. And that's a little anecdote of Ratzinger, making a joke to him. So, okay, so what are we going to gather from this? I mean, so Bunini is not a good guy. Okay, he definitely is not. The composition of the new missal was botched. right? And I mean, and this is me. Bouye doesn't talk about this, but I mean, I was reading the offertory of the 1962 and the 1969, and it's atrocious. The whole offertory is gone. It's incredible. So I mean, the problems, because yes, in the silly season, there was horrendous abuses. Priests driving up to the altar on a motorcycle. I think Bishop Barron said that one. Priests using cookies instead of a host. Just crazy dancing around the altar. Thousands of Eucharistic ministers. And just this nonsense going on with, AC/DC playing during Mass. I think Matt Fradd talks about that, right? It was insane. It was completely insane. And but then, you could say, well, we don't have that anymore, so everything's fine. But here's the problem, right? There is needed a reform of the reform, not just because of the abuses, but the missal itself, right, was botched. Now, does this mean that the new missal is, a product of Satan? No. Why? Because of what I said in the last episode. Right? This is something promulgated by the office of the church. And Bouye himself, who was very critical of how fast it was done, said that there are pearls here that we discard at our disadvantage. But the problem is, Bouye was the one who was leading, right, this liturgical movement. And there's a whole history there. He started a liturgical movement. It kind of went off the rails, so he stepped away from it. But then he was called back by the Pope, not the subsequent, movement that kind of went off the rails. But so Bouye knew that there needed to be a reform of the liturgy. Something was wrong. And so now we're going to turn to Joseph Ratzinger to talk about that. So all that is to say that the liturgical issues, right, are real, but the office does not defect and did not promulgate a mass of Satan, right, as some would say, but there is a need of a reform of that reform. So in other words, you have issues in the old missal, it needed reform, and you clearly have issues in the new missal because of what I just read to you, but Bouye is saying all this chaos needs a reform. And Ratzinger becomes Pope and says, we need a reform of the reform. So Bouye and Ratzinger are two of the experts at the Second Vatican Council, right? So this is not a traditionalist diatribe. This is not a, it's neither is it an overreaction on the other side. I'm talking about these two great theologians who said the liturgy needs reform. The reform that happened was botched. Therefore, we need a reform of the reform. This is the point, right? So let's turn to Joseph Ratzinger. And we're not going to talk, actually, I know I said that. We're not going to talk about what needed reform in the old missal. I'll probably do that next episode. We're first going to talk about Ratzinger's critique of what happened after the council when it comes to the liturgy. Now, this is what Ratzinger says. This is from his book, The Feast of Faith. He says, the crisis in liturgy, and hence in the church, in which we find ourselves, has very little to do with the change from the old to the new liturgical books. So, in this very book, Ratzinger quotes Bouye. So, Bouye is critical of the botched reform. That's true. But he also says there's pearls, and we can't get rid of them. He extols one of the prefaces. He extols the increase in scripture readings. He extols the Eucharistic prayers, 3 of them. I didn't tell you guys the story of the 4th one. I'll leave that for another time. So he extols a lot of things, but he also criticizes a lot of things. And Ratzinger here is basically saying the same thing. He's saying the crisis in the liturgy, and hence in the church in which we find ourselves, has very little to do with the change from the old to the new liturgical books. Well, and he expounds, right? He'll explain this. But notice he says very little, which means it has something to do with it, but he expounds. He says here, the basic concepts of the new view are creativity, freedom, celebration, and community. It sees things like right, obligation, interiority, and church order as negative factors belonging to the old liturgy, which is to be superseded. In other words, his critique is in a change of mindset. And in fact, he says that this change of mindsets is basically the unleashing of what was wrong before the council, where the Mass had become something just crystallized and distant and unintelligible, while people kind of had their own devotions in the pews and couldn't hear the priest or the altar servers. And well, there's different aspects as well, even in the actual structure of the 1962, certain things which needed simplification or reform, emphasis, or certain words placed in different places, etc. But at the end of the day, what happened was you had this kind of callousness, this coldness. And so when the missal changed, the problem of that callousness and coldness became the problem of creativity, expression. It's kind of like a neurosis, right? Think of what Freud calls repression, right? If you repress yourself, you become neurotic, and then you you become self-destructive or whatever. I mean, that's a little bit of an oversimplification. But the point being here is that, what happened in the liturgy after the council was a product of what was going on before the council. That can be oversimplified, so I don't want to, press on that too much. But in other words here, Ratzinger is critiquing the mindsets. It's not really the liturgical books. It's the problem is with the faith. People don't have a genuine faith. So I'll continue. Ratzinger says, the fundamental idea here, and so he's critiquing the new mindset. The fundamental idea here is that liturgy is a community celebration, an act in which the community forms and experiences itself as such. In fact, this means that the liturgy more and more acquires a party character and atmosphere, as we see, for instance, in the increased importance attached to the words of greeting and dismissal, and in the search for elements with entertainment value. A successful liturgical celebration is judged by the effects achieved in this way. Liturgy is thus dependent on the creativity, the ideas of those who organize it. And so, and Ratzinger, obviously, as you all know, is a deeply insightful theologian, and so he goes on to explain why this is problematic, where it comes from, and what the right attitude is to have towards the liturgy. In other words, what is the right attitude of the faith of the church? Because the liturgy is the prayer of the church. So he continues, here liturgy means playing with the various roles, with everyone playing together and creating the celebration. So it's very subjective, and it comes from the community as opposed to from God, and received by the community so that it can be transformed into God, right? He also says, if we are really to be made free, we need also to break out of the restrictions of roles. We need to lay them aside and allow our real selves to come to light. So he's arguing for real freedom, real liberation, which is not the one that we see or that we saw. I would say that we still see. We need a reform of the reform. And it goes much deeper than saying, hey, there's no more dancing on the altar, right? Okay, he continues. There needs to be a reason for the feast, an objective reason prior to the individual's will. In other words, I can only celebrate freedom if I am free. Otherwise, it is tragic self-delusion. I can only celebrate joy if the world and human existence really give me reason to rejoice. Am I free? Is there cause for joy? Where these questions are excluded, the party, the post-religious world's attempt to rediscover the feast, is soon revealed as a tragic masquerade. Maybe, go back in this episode, on the 30 seconds prior button and re-listen to that quote a few times, and then pause it and then think about that. It's very profound. Okay. I'm going to continue here because these quotes are very telling. So he says here, the freedom with which we are concerned in the Christian feast, the Feast of the Eucharist, is not the freedom to devise new texts, but the liberation of the world and ourselves from death. Wow. This is an otherworldly freedom. Anyway, and he continues in this section here. He says, secondly, it follows that liturgy has a cosmic and universal dimension. The community does not become a community by mutual interaction. It receives its being as a gift from an already existing completeness, totality, and in return, it gives itself back to this totality. Liturgy cannot be made. This is why it has to be simply received as a given reality and continually revitalized. This is why its universality is expressed in a form binding on the whole church, committed to the local congregation in the form of the rite, R-I-T-E, right? The form, the rite. As feast, liturgy goes beyond the realm of what can be made and manipulated. It introduces us to the realm of given, living reality, which communicates itself to us. So, in other words, there's a real eschatological numbing that took place, right? We've forgotten the transcendent, and we became worldly. And Ratzinger, I've said this before, talks about this in his 1958 article on the new pagans and the church. He argues that the church is pagan and only Christian in name, right? There was a deep lack of faith in the church before the council, right? It was a confessional faith. It was a liberal faith, really, right? It was the faith that was a assent to propositions, but my life was one of an atheist. It was the modern bourgeois atheistic lifestyle of the secular state. We live in a secular world. And so really a revitalizing of the faith needs to be, it needs to be radical. And what we're seeing in the liturgy is this misunderstanding. And it's still here. And we don't even realize it's still here. We don't even see that what we have, needs to be purified. It needs to be reformed. And the fact that we don't even see that shows how deeply secularism has seeped into us without us even knowing it. Anyway, so I'm getting a little passionate here, but okay. Okay, last quote from this chapter. Oh man, I could keep going. There's just so much here. I'm gonna read some more because this is important. He says here, moreover, the obligatory character of the essential parts of the liturgy also guarantees the true freedom of the faithful. In other words, stop making stuff up. Do what the Missal says, and that applies to lay people. All right, I'm going to try to calm down. Okay. So the obligatory character of the essential parts of the liturgy also guarantees the true freedom of the faithful. It makes sure that they are not victims of something fabricated by an individual or a group, that they are sharing in the same liturgy that binds the priest, the bishop, and the pope. In the liturgy, we are all given the freedom to appropriate in our own personal way the mystery which addresses us. So it's beautifully dynamic, and it's beautifully true. Ratzinger goes on. This means that in the area of liturgical participation, which is at its most profound a participatio Dei, right? Participation in God, and hence in life and freedom. The process of interiorization is of prime importance. I just went to Mass last Sunday, obviously, and I noticed that there was not a single moment of silence. Not a single one. During the offertory, when the priest was, bringing the gifts, the gifts were brought to the altar, the priest was setting things up. The choir was singing. During the canon, right, the priest was saying the prayers, which I think is great. During communion, the choir was singing. It was like they were trying to fill up the time. The silence was uncomfortable, maybe, I don't know, but it wasn't an option. Silence meant we have a problem. We need to fill that up. Why? There was literally not a second of silence. Okay, maybe there was a second, but there was no silence. The only silence was the few seconds during the transition between what the priest said and what the choir was doing. So more silence so that we can have actual active participation. Ratzinger continues, we need to be led from the form to the content. We need an education which will help us to grow into an inner appropriation of the Church's common liturgy. So, this is also a basic principle of moral theology, which is law frees us. It's the liberal concept that pits law against freedom, right? In liberal liberty, right, freedom is the ability to not be restrained in your choices. You can do whatever you want, just don't infringe the choices of others. But in classical freedom, law is seen as the traffic lights. Without them, there's chaos. With them, there's free-flowing traffic. And so the structure of the liturgy given to us by the Church, when appropriated and when we let it shape us, we become actually free and liberated. But when we ourselves try to make up things, that's the liberal idea of freedom. It's not the classical understanding of freedom. And the Church wants us to be genuinely free and not enslaved by the ideology of liberal libertarianism. Ratzinger continues, the theology of creation and the theology of the resurrection, which includes and ratifies incarnation, demand that prayer should be expressed in a bodily form, involving all the dimensions of bodily expression. The spiritualization of the body calls for the embodiment of the spirit, and vice versa. Only in this way can man and the world be humanized, which means that matter is brought to its spiritual capacity and that the spirit is expressed in the wealth of creation. That's just beautiful. Go ahead and reread that. He then says, to liturgy belong both speech and silence, singing, the praise of instruments, the visual image, the symbol, and the gesture which corresponds to the word. See, all these elements. And silence is what makes everything so much more meaningful when there is a gesture or a word, right? He goes on to say, if there is to be a real participatio actuosa, active participation, there must be silence. In this silence, together, we journey inward, becoming aware of word and sign, leaving behind the roles which conceal our real selves. In silence, man bides and abides. He becomes aware of abiding reality. Liturgy's tension, tautness, does not come from variety, as B. Kleinheyer has correctly observed, but from the fact that it creates a space in which we can encounter what is truly great and inexhaustible, something that does not need variety because it suffices, namely, truth and love. And this is the last quote. The only way we can be saved from succumbing to the inflation of words is if we have the courage to face silence and in it learn to listen afresh to the word. Otherwise, we shall be overwhelmed by mere words at the very point where we should be encountering the word, the Logos, the word of love, crucified and risen, who brings us life and joy. So in conclusion, and we'll go ahead and revisit this topic at length. But in conclusion, the problem isn't so much with the old versus the new missal. In fact, I would say the problem is with both. The problem here is faith. There's a crisis in faith. And so we need a reform of the reform. And that reform has to be radical, it has to be entire, and it has to be existential. It can't just be the change of rubrics. So in other words, this is the wisdom of Pope Benedict. Instead of saying, okay, let's go ahead and fix this part of the Mass, this part of the Mass. I mean, he does give suggestions, like he thinks we should move the Kiss of Peace, but that's a different topic. He gives suggestions, but he concludes ultimately that it's not really about the books. It's not really about that. It's about the faith. It's about the fact that we're pagans. So this series really is to say that the council, in fact, was addressing a form of paganism, right? It was addressing secularism. I really think, the more I've been studying this, that, if you want to understand the Second Vatican Council with its limitations, right? If you want to understand its goal, if you want to understand what the church is trying to say and do, what the intention of the church is, and how we should actualize that intention here and now, you have to understand secularism. Secularism. That's what the church is addressing. Because the church is the house of faith. And there was and is a crisis in the faith. So that being said, thanks for listening. And we'll revisit this topic at length in many more episodes to come. If you like this content, please leave us a review, subscribe, and if you want to support us, go to patreon.com/theLogosProject. And without further ado, we'll see you guys next week.